Good afternoon, everybody. This is a very packed session. We have 7 presentations that we have to complete before lunchtime. Each of the presenters has agreed to present in a very economical way, and it's 2 separate sessions that we're having. So the first session we're having, and welcome back, and my name is Alan Hirsch. I'm the director of the Graduate School of Development, Policy and Practice at UCT, at the University of Cape Town. And we're partners in the Social and Economic Inequality Project. We're a node with the London School of Economics. In fact, we'll be teaching the non-residential group in September. So I'm very, very honored to be here and very happy to be a part of the Atlantic family of programs on inequality, which this is an important meeting point for. But without any further ado, I'd like to introduce the 3 panelists who are going to be speaking first. They're all at various stages of completing their PhDs. Some are making final corrections, some are writing final chapters or checking their bibliographies. We have 3, I'm going to introduce them now, and then they're going to come and speak consecutively because of the pressure of time. They each have 10 minutes to talk, and at the end of their presentations, we should have a few minutes for 1 or 2 questions or queries if people would like to raise them. Firstly, Kerris Cooper, PhD student at LSE, who is also who's based and working at the Center for Analysis and Social Exclusion, social exclusion, and you'll see that her research meshes very well into some of the research that was presented earlier today on parenting and divergence or convergence. Refilwe Lepelle is a PhD student in economics at the University of Cape Town. She also lectures in economics, and she teaches some of the big undergraduate classes. She is an expert on trade and labor market issues, and you'll see that she'll be looking at the relationship between trade reform and the impact of trade reform on labor markets at a community level, at a local level. And then finally, we have Lisa Windsteiger, who has nearly completed her PhD at LSE, and she's moving to a position of senior researcher in the Max Planck Institute in Munich in a couple of months' time. And she will be talking about the gap between the reality of discrimination and inequality and the demand for redistribution. So with just one final remark, somebody has mislaid a cell phone. No, whose is it? What is it? That, yeah, okay. Kerris. So this is the first of 2 consecutive sessions. Once the PhDs have completed their presentation, the discussion, we'll be moving to the 4 research programs, the visiting research programs that are part of the program, who will be introducing the work that they're doing briefly before lunch.
Great, thank you. It's great to be talking here today. I'm going to very briefly summarise some of the findings from my thesis on the topic of poverty and parenting in the UK. And what brought me to this topic is actually concern about inequalities in children's outcomes. So you've already heard today that by the time children start school in the UK, there's already an achievement gap between children from low-income households and their better-off peers. And one possible explanation for this is differences in parenting. And in the UK, the policy focus has been shifting more towards parenting rather than poverty as being the main explanation for these differences in children's outcomes, and also the appropriate focus for policy intervention. But as you've already heard today, the two are actually very much connected to each other. So given this, I'm interested in understanding more about the relationship between economic hardship and parenting in the UK, and what mechanisms explain this relationship. Now, the UK offers an interesting context to examine these questions in, because alongside an increased focus in parenting policy, there have also been cuts to benefits, which have left low-income families worse off, and an increase in child poverty, which is predicted to increase further still. So to answer this question, I'm using the UK Millennium Cohort Study. I'm presenting results today based on when the cohort children are aged 5 years old. I'm only looking at the parenting behaviours of mothers, and I'm taking into account other possible confounding factors, such as mothers' education and work status. I measure parenting across these 4 domains, so meeting the child's physical needs in terms of nutrition and physical activity, the parent-child relationship, discipline and control, and cognitive stimulation. And I have 38 self-reported measures of parenting that fit into these 4 domains. So do parenting behaviours differ across different income groups? I look across the full income distribution rather than focusing just on parents in income poverty, and I specifically compare mothers in the lowest income group with mothers on median incomes. And I find that actually it's not straightforwardly the case that low-income parents are doing worse. And in fact, there are some parenting behaviours in which low-income mothers are scoring better than mothers on median incomes. And you can see some examples in this bar chart. So the orange bars represent mothers in the lowest income group, and the yellow bars represent mothers in median income group. And as you can see, mothers in the lowest income group report more frequently helping their child with maths, writing, taking part in physical activities with them, and taking them to the park more frequently. Nevertheless, there are some negative differences in parenting, but as you can see from this second chart, these differences are not specific to low-income parents. So it's not that low-income parents are a group of parents behaving differently from everybody else, but actually these differences seem to be part of a broader income parenting gradient that extends across the full income distribution. So you can see in terms of these 4 parenting measures, trips out, meeting the child's physical needs, hours of television, and routine meal and bedtimes, you can see that parents in the lowest income group are scoring lower than parents in the median income group, but parents in the highest income group are scoring higher still. So this is a pattern that extends across the full income distribution. So what mechanisms might explain some of these relationships? There's a dominant and well-evidenced theory in the US called the family stress model, which suggests that, as you might expect, living in poverty is actually very stressful. And this stress has a negative impact on how parents behave with their children in a way that's detrimental for their children's outcomes. I test this family stress model using the UK data, and I look at different parenting behaviours. And I do this using a technique called structural equation modelling, which allows me to test the significance of these indirect pathways between economic hardship and parenting behaviours. So how much of this relationship is actually explained via the relationship between economic hardship and mother's mental health and life satisfaction. And I do find that for meeting the child's physical needs, routine meal and bedtimes, and educational activities, that actually some of this relationship is explained by mother's mental health and life satisfaction. So between 21% and 37% of this relationship is operating through these mechanisms. However, this arrow at the top here is still significant, so there's still some unexplained relationship going on. When it comes to arguably more emotion-driven parenting behaviours, actually mother's mental health and life satisfaction fully explains the relationship with economic hardship. So this is the case for how close the mother reports feeling to the child, for both authoritative and harsh discipline techniques, and for frequency of play activities with the child. So this direct relationship is no longer significant, and the relationship between economic hardship and these parenting behaviours is fully explained by the negative impact on mother's mental health and life satisfaction. And finally, for these 2 parenting measures, trips outside of the home and hours of television and computer games, actually the family stress model doesn't have any explanatory power here. So these indirect pathways are not significant. The relationship remains unexplained by this model. I think these results are quite intuitive, particularly with trips outside of the home, where there's likely to be direct cost, not just of the trips out themselves, but also perhaps with transport and getting there. So to summarise, I find that it's not straightforwardly the case that poor parents are parenting worse than other parents, and that where there are negative differences, these are often part of a broader income parenting pattern that extends across the full income distribution. I find that a lot of these negative relationships are explained to a greater or lesser extent by the negative impact that economic hardship can have on mothers' mental health. And in terms of implications for policy, these findings suggest that focusing on parenting classes and parenting support alone will only get us so far, and that actually we need to take into account the economic context in which parenting takes place. And this is likely to mean protecting family incomes. These results also highlight the importance of mothers' mental health as another possible area for policy intervention, but again, this should not be at the expense of taking into account the economic context as well, as we know that this is also important for mothers' mental health. And I'm hoping I've stuck to time, and I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening.
Good morning. The title of my thesis is Trade Reform and Local Labour Markets in Post-Apartheid South Africa. Improving the rate at which new job opportunities are created in South Africa is a key economic challenge for policymakers. This is because unemployment rate is very high and persistent. It grew from 26.5% in the fourth quarter of 2016 to 27.7% in the first quarter of 2017. In this thesis, we are interested in looking at the labor market because studies have shown that the labor market dominates household income distribution. A study by Liebert and others in 2010 revealed that wage income, which includes self-employment income, contributes about 70% to the household income, and that it makes an even larger contribution to inequality of around 85%. Empirical research on the sources of this poor employment growth in South Africa is widespread. Some studies have pointed to supply-side factors, which include poor education, skills shortage, regulatory impediments, as well as the introduction of wage bargaining councils. This area of research has been relatively well covered using household data, while other studies have looked at demand-side factors, which include international trade and technological change. Although this literature implies that trade and technological change reduced the labor content of output and possibly the share of unskilled labor in production, this literature has a number of shortcomings. I'll mention just the three of them. The first, it uses national or industry level data, so it ignores firm heterogeneity. Second, it assumes that labor is fully mobile in South Africa. And third, it has failed to take into consideration that there are factor rigidities across regions and also across industries. So the role of trade and trade policy, as well as its gender-biased effects on the local labor market in South Africa, has not been fully explored. The expected impact of trade across regions is not uniform, given the fact that there are different factor endowments across regions, different proximity to borders, as well as initial industrial structures. The local labor market effects of trade have become an increasing interest internationally, with studies done by Otto and others in 2013, as well as Gaddis and Peters in 2014, among others. However, this literature is very limited when it comes to emerging markets, especially in South Africa. So this thesis aims to contribute to the literature, to the existing literature, by looking at the local labor market effects of trade using South Africa as a case study. And by so doing, what we are doing is that we are now introducing trade as a potential contributing factor, and also we are providing a spatial dimension to the analysis of trade, the effect of trade on local labor markets rather. South Africa is an interesting country to look at because it has high unemployment rate and is one of the countries with the highest inequalities in the world. But over and above that, we have huge spatial inequality, which is a legacy that we inherited from apartheid. So the main research question for my thesis is, what are the effects of international trade on local labor markets in South Africa in the post-apartheid period? And to answer this main research question, we aim to answer the two sub-questions. What are the effects of trade on local labor market outcomes in South Africa? And we are looking at employment rate, percentage of unemployed, and labor force participation rate. And the second question is, do international trade effects on the local labor market vary by gender and skill levels? In order to meet our objectives, we use two main data sources. The first is the tariff and effective rate of protection data, which spans from 1988 to 2014, and this was obtained from Edwards in 2015. The second is the population census data for 1996, 2001, and 2011. This provides us with individual data in terms of employment status, industry in which people are employed, gender, as well as education levels, which we use as a proxy for skill level. We aggregate this individual data to the municipalities, and that we find that we use the municipalities as our unit of analysis, and there are 234 municipalities in South Africa. For empirical approach, we follow a methodology that was pioneered by Topolova in 2007 and 2010, and this was also used by Gaddis and Peters in 2014. So given the fact that there's geographic variation in terms of initial industry structure in South Africa, as well as variation across industries in terms of the reduction of tariffs, this suggests to us that there is variation in terms of the intensity with which the municipalities are exposed to trade. So by comparing municipalities that have high trade exposure and those that have low trade exposure, we'll be able to identify the relative effect of trade on labor market outcomes. So we do this by following a two-step approach. The first approach, we construct the municipality trade protection measure by weighing the tariff rates by the initial employment shares in each municipality, as shown by equation 1. And the second step, we use the panel estimation approach, as shown by equation 2, where our dependent variable YMT represents employment, unemployment, and labor force participation, this as a share of the working age population. So these are individuals who are aged between 15 and 65. Our main variable of interest is log TP, which is a log trade protection measure. X prime M represents the initial municipality characteristics. Here we are focusing on the skill share, which is individuals who are regarded as skilled, who are employed as a percentage of total employment in each municipality. And we regard people who are skilled as those who have matric or grade 12 qualification and higher. The second characteristics is the tradable sector employment as a share of total employment. And the tradable sector, we are focusing on manufacturing, agriculture, and mining. So we interact these two characteristics by the post-1996 dummy variables, so dummy variable for 2001 and dummy variable for 2011. This gives us a time-varying effect. We also control for municipality fixed effects, which is the delta M, and time fixed effects, which is the gamma T. Okay. So these are our results. The first column is just a simple regression where we are showing the effect of the reduction of tariffs on employment rates, but we're not controlling for any initial municipality characteristics, and we see that there's no significant relationship. But when we control for initial skill share in column 2, we see that our coefficient increases and becomes significant. So we interpret this by saying that increase in tariffs will increase employment rate. But given the fact that our tariffs have been reducing since 1994 through the trade reform, we say that a reduction in the tariffs has resulted in a decline in the employment rate in South Africa. So when we also control for initial tradable share, which is shown in column 3, we see that our coefficient increases and continues to be significant, again implying that trade reform had negative impact on our employment rate. In the column 4, we are looking at the percentage of unemployed, and we see that the relationship is not significant. And in column 5, we see that trade reform slowed the growth of labor force participation rate in South Africa. When we compare our results by gender, we see that both males and females were negatively affected by the trade reform. However, the effect was stronger on the male population, and this could reflect the fact that most men are employed in the tradable sector, while women are employed in the non-tradable sector or the services sector. Also in South Africa, we find that out of the employed people, women are more skilled than men. So it could also mean that women were able to relocate from the tradable sector to the non-tradable sector. When we look at our results by skill, we see that both the skilled and unskilled population was negatively affected when we're looking at the employment rate. However, the negative effect was more on the unskilled population and in terms of employment rate, but we can't make the same comparison between labor force participation because labor tariff rates did not have any effect on the labor force participation rate for the skilled population. So in conclusion, I can say that our results are consistent with existing literature, particularly those from Brazil, and also that trade reform has a negative effect on employment rate and labor force participation in South Africa, and that remote areas are isolated from this negative effect of trade, and that trade reform has a strong negative effect on male employment, showing that trade actually contributed to the narrowing employment gap and narrowing labor force participation gap. And lastly, trade reform falls disproportionately on the unskilled population, this meaning that trade also contributed to the widening inequality in South Africa. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Lisa, and I'll talk about one paper of my dissertation today, and this is about the redistributive consequences of segregation. The main question that I wanted to investigate in this paper is why do we in general observe a non-monotone relationship between income inequality and a support for redistributive policies in society. For instance, we know that income inequality has increased over the past 35 to 40 years, but in most industrialized countries, but in general, demand for redistribution hasn't exhibited the same trend in these societies over this time period. And here I mean both demand for redistribution as proxied by realized tax rates, but of course there's many reasons why realized tax rates need not correspond to demand for redistribution in society. But I also mean demand for redistribution as measured by national household surveys. And that's surprising because standard political economy models would predict that high rates of inequality trigger high demand for redistribution. At the same time, we also know that socioeconomic segregation is high, especially in areas with high income inequality. And we also know that people do have misperceptions about the shape of the income distribution. Specifically, what Norton and his co-authors find is that people tend to underestimate income and wealth inequality and pay differences between rich and poor. And that's also what I find in my own survey, about which I will talk in a minute. So what I do in my paper is I'm putting all these pieces together. And I build a theoretical model in which people are segregated according to income, so they interact mainly with people who have similar incomes to themselves, and as a result, they lose sight of the overall shape of the income distribution, and they become biased about the shape of the income distribution. And this then, of course, has an effect on their preferences for redistribution. Specifically, because I assume that people are biased in the way that we observe empirically, namely that they underestimate income inequality and pay differences between rich and poor. Intuitively, in my model, there is less demand for redistribution than in a standard model without segregation and misperceptions. More interestingly, what I also find is that an increase in inequality in my model will always lead to a smaller increase in demand for redistribution than in a standard model, and can even lead to a decrease in demand for redistribution due to the added elements of segregation and misperceptions. So the intuition here is that because people are segregated, they don't see the whole extent of the increase in income inequality, and therefore the demand for redistribution increases by less. And it can even be the case that because segregation in my model changes due to the change in income inequality, it can even be the case that people after the increase in income inequality are more biased about the income distribution than before, and so they want less redistribution than before. But I won't go more into this theoretical model here. It's all on my website, so you can read the paper if you want. What I want to talk about here for the rest of the time is some empirical evidence that I collected to support the assumptions that I make in my theoretical model. Specifically, I wanted to see whether people do in fact have the biases about the shape of the income distribution that I assume in my model and that also other people have found in their surveys. And specifically, I wanted to see whether these misperceptions are somehow correlated with segregation. So what I did was I did a survey via Amazon Mechanical Turk in the US, and I asked people about their own household income and about certain perceived characteristics of the overall income distribution. So I asked them, what do you think is average household income? What do you think is average household income of the top 10%, the top 1%, and so on. And I also asked them questions about their social circle to figure out how segregated these people are. So basically, I wanted to see, ask whether, how diverse their social circle is, basically. And so what I find, of course, I can't go into every detail here, so the general result on the biases is I do indeed find the biases that I assume in my model and that also other people have found. So in general, for instance, people's estimate of average income in society is increasing in their own income. I have a lot of results on that. They can all be found on my website. But what I want to go into here now is especially how are these misperceptions correlated with segregation. So I asked people about their social circle. There's two ways I did this. One way is I asked them the Lin position generator question. And this is very much using the methodology that also Professor Savage and his co-authors used in their social class work. And so I give people a list of professions ranging from secretary, cleaner, university lecturer, CEO, to artist and solicitor. And I ask them, which of these professions do you know socially? And then I assign to each of these professions a score that tells me the social status of this profession. So low score means high social status, high score means low social status, and then I assign to each respondent the standard deviation of their response, and I use as a proxy for how diverse their social circle is. So that's one measure of characterizing their social circle, and the other way I analyze their social circle is I ask people specifically about their family, their friends, and their work environment, and ask them about household income and education of these people. And then again, I construct via factor analysis a factor that proxies, again, diversity of their social circle. And the result is basically that with both of these measures, I find that people's misperceptions are less severe the more diverse their social circle is. And let me point out also a third way in which I tried to characterize social segregation, which didn't work because I think it's always interesting also to hear what doesn't work. So I also had data on county level economic segregation in the US. And so I assigned to each respondent their county that they live in and the socioeconomic segregation in their county, but connecting this to those people's misperceptions, that didn't work. And I think it's probably because it's more about their own individual social segregation and not about specifically the area county level segregation. Well, but So let me conclude. So I have this theoretical model about segregation and misperceptions and resulting lower demand for redistribution. And I also have this empirical analysis where I try to analyze how segregation and misperceptions are correlated. And here, as I said, I did this initial survey on the US. But of course, what would be very interesting is to extend this survey also to other countries, and that's what I'm working on now. So my next paper will be about these misperceptions and segregation in European countries specifically.
Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes. The way I want to do this is actually just to ask for 3 comments or questions, and then to allow the, who can be directed to any or all of them, and then we'll get a response if a response is required. So any questions? Or the back in the white shirt? Any more? On this side in the red shirt? And in the middle with a t-shirt.
Thank you. I'm Paul Segal. I'm at KCL down the road, and I'm a visiting fellow here at the III LSE. I thought all 3 were fantastic presentations, really interesting work. I have a question for Refilwe on South Africa. So the thing that's always really struck me about South Africa is the extremely high unemployment rate, which is really exceptional among developing countries, among any countries. But I mean, in countries in Latin America, for instance, where I tend to work, you don't see anything like that level of unemployment because people will just go and sell stuff on the street. They'll find some way to make a living, however meager it may be. So now, for me, that really demands explanation. I'd love to know why that's going on. I assume it's some kind of rigidity, but I don't know what that rigidity is. But whatever it is, I wonder if that's the same thing that's explaining your findings, because the standard economic model of what happens when you get a change in a reduction in trade tariffs is you lose some jobs, but you create new jobs at the same time, and you create new jobs and workers move from the kind of previously dominant sectors to the new favoured sectors, and that's what seems to be not happening. So my question is, what's the explanation for that, and might it be the same explanation for that initially very high level of unemployment?
Okay, next question over here.
Hi, my name is Federico. I am a student of University of Sussex. Thank you very much for your presentations, and my question is to Lisa. I found very interesting your work. I am also working in the same topic. So my question first is, your idea is segregation is impacting in preference for distribution via the misperceptions or directly? Because I don't know, I was thinking that could be also impacting directly preference for distribution and not only via the misunderstanding of your income position. And I was thinking that in which way are you exactly working? And also, if you are considering in the literature about why the Meltzer and Richard hypothesis is not working in the world and so on, there are some papers that say like, okay, in more unequal countries have more media capture because the people that is richer capture the media to to the poor people, believe that they don't have to prone or to be more supportive of redistribution policies. So I want to know if you are trying to incorporate this issue also in your research. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last one in the middle.
Hi, Ollie. I'm a master's student at LSE. My question is for Kerris. So, as I understand it, it seems as if your research has mainly looked at the role of income in parenting, relation to parenting. I'm just wondering if you were able to pick up anything through your research as well about the role of the parents' own parenting, if that makes sense, in terms of the experiences that they had from their parents in their early childhood and the kind of the impact that that has had in turn on their own parenting style, kind of setting income to one side.
Great, thank you very much. Can we have one of the roving mics for the panelists? Thanks. So those are big questions, all of them, and obviously these brilliant young students are not going to be able to address all of them in the time that we have. But thank you.
Okay, so I'll answer the first question. I think there are a number of factors. The first is that you mentioned that other countries, they've got an informal sector. So in South Africa, we have a very small informal sector. And this is something that was, it's a result of apartheid because people were not allowed to sell on the streets. So they had to have certain designated areas. And so many people did not go into the informal sector. And even now, it's actually looked down upon to be working in the informal sector in South Africa. Second is that there is a structural change in the economy where we are moving from the manufacturing towards the services sector. However, that requires skill, some level of skill or education. That's another issue in South Africa. So we have like these structural issues where people don't have enough education or skill, or there's a mismatch in the economy in terms of the demand for labor and the supply that we have. we have a lot of unskilled people in South Africa. And I think the other one would be, there's a demand also for artisans. However, what you find is that those who do acquire some education go for the formal education, so go to universities and technicons, but they don't go to technical schools where they can get that kind of technical skill. So again, there's a mismatch in terms of demand and supply in terms of labor. So that's what I could think of as some of the contributing factors to this high unemployment in South Africa.
Yeah, thank you very much for the questions. Concerning segregation, yes, in my paper I focus really on the role of segregation affecting misperceptions and that affecting demand for redistribution. I think if you include other ways in which segregation could affect demand for redistribution, for example, through trying to benefit your own group and so on, and also thinking about like that, of course, segregation affects social mobility, and that, you know, going to a posh school and then to a posh university, it gives you a posh social circle, which gives you a posh job, and so on. that of course would enhance, I think, the effects of segregation on demand for redistribution and therefore on post-redistribution inequality. And the second point I think is also interesting about media capture. I mean, I've thought about a related issue, which is basically to see like how can portrayals of certain social classes in the media affect demand for redistribution. And I think it's very interesting if you look, for example, at, I think here in the UK, it's mainly, you know, you've got all these TV programs about like the poor, like Benefit Street and the wife swap and stuff like this, which focuses very much on like how the poor live. There's not so much about like how the rich live. I mean, there's some celebrity stories, but I mean, the rich, like, I mean, the CEOs and stuff like this, there's not much insight into how they live, and probably that has an effect on demand for distribution as well. So I think that's a very good point.
Okay, thank you for your question. That is an interesting topic about how influential your own parenting as a child affects your parenting as an adult. In the data set that I'm using, I don't have much information on this, so I know I have a measure of whether the mother was in care as a child, which is a very tiny proportion of the sample, and I've got a measure of whether their parents got divorced. I haven't included that in my model with the many other factors, but there is a large literature on the different factors that affect parenting, so there's definitely some research that answers your research question. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. These are the kind of experts who are emerging in our field, and it's very exciting to have this session. For the next session, I'd like to ask, while we're making the change, for the four presenters to come up to the stage, and I will very briefly introduce you. Just to explain that the Atlantic Fellows Program on Social and Economic Inequality has three key elements. The first element is the residential Masters in Inequality, which is taught at the London School of Economics. The second is a non-residential Fellows Program, which is taught at the moment it's a non-residential non-masters, but it's a very intensive program, a fellowship program taught at the moment at the London School of Economics and at the University of Cape Town, and other partners will be coming in, including a partner in Chile. And then the third program is a program called the Visiting Fellow Program, which is a program that encourages collaboration in research between people at the London School of Economics and others, including people from other universities and practitioners and leaders in their various fields. And the four projects that are being presented today, and they're at a very early stage of development, are the project on development, testing, and publication of an inequality framework and toolkit, which will be presented by Abigail McKnight. The second one on gender inequalities through self-help groups in GOND, Adivasi Communities of Canker in India will be presented by Dr. Naila Kabeer, both of LSE. The third, project is called Goodbye Tito, the role of diverging welfare state trajectories on income inequality in the four former Yugoslav republics, which Dr. William Bartlett will be presenting. And then the final one is The Revolt of the Rust Belt, Communal Roots of Anti-Systemic Politics in the US and UK, which will be presented by Dr. Lisa McKenzie. So I'm not going to reintroduce them, and they will follow each other in succession as we have a fairly tight program and we want to give them time. So welcome and thank you.
I've only got five or 6 minutes, so I'm going to be very quick. I'm just going to give you a brief outline of the project that we have planned, and which we have in fact started on. I'm the academic lead, but there's a team of 9 of us. I hope this will be enough to garner your interest and hopefully encourage you to engage with us as the project progresses and you can follow our updates. And I hope this also demonstrates some of the very positive features of the Atlantic Visiting Fellows Programme, which is it's a fairly unusual type of funding stream for us because it allows us to do things in a different way, and I think there's some really great advantages to that. So our key objectives really are 2. One is that we wanted to develop an inequality framework and toolkit, which has strong theoretical foundations, but yet is very practical, because we're working with Oxfam, and they needed to help activists and practitioners both improve their understanding of inequalities and to use it to assist the design of effective strategies to tackle inequalities. And the second one really is an objective which is about collaborative working. So it's to produce this framework and toolkit, which both builds on academic research, so current academic research on inequality, its measurement, and inequality frameworks, but combine this with practitioner, activists, and policy expertise held within Oxfam. So we see those 2 as very important key objectives that we'd like the project to achieve. This is a kind of schematic diagram of how we're working. We've got a kind of core team in the middle, as I say, there's quite a few of us. It's a slightly different design to some of the other programs funded through this. We have a wider team of advisors. There's an advisory group in Oxfam, and we hope to engage with you, a wider academic expert audience, as well as practitioners. That's a kind of our model that we're working on. In terms of the framework, I'm going to go through this quite quickly. We are working on developing an inequality measurement framework. This needs to allow Oxfam country teams to produce snapshots of inequality. It needs to be multidimensional and to capture more than economic inequalities. We need it to be theoretically grounded, to reflect the links between inequality and poverty. Oxfam key goals still reflected around reducing poverty and tackling human rights issues. And it also needs to be practical. In terms of progress, because we started at some point in May, the core country team have been working with some of our advisors, and we're proposing at this stage that we develop a capability-based inequality measurement framework. That's based on SEN's capability approach. There are a number of reasons for this. I don't have time to go into them all here, but the strong connections with human rights, with poverty, and giving us a strong theoretical basis. And so we're drawing up a conceptual note, drawing on some of the theory that's been worked on already in this area, recent research looking at how you can extend SEN's capability approach to look at capability inequality as opposed to capability poverty, which is more commonly looked at. And some of our colleagues here at CASE and LSE have been working on that, including Tanya Burkhardt, who's here. So we have to be able to allow for looking at capabilities which are both bad as well as good. We need to be able to look at concentration and surpluses, which can have negative effects on other people. So your capabilities can have harmful effects on others, and for non-linearities. So a number of complexities that we need to look at in terms of moving from sort of already well-grounded theoretical basis to adapting it to the needs for this project. And we're drawing also on some work that's been done, both Polly Vizard and Tanya Burkhardt have done some work for the Equality and Human Rights Commission here in Britain, designing an equality measurement framework, and we're drawing a lot and hoping to build on that. The toolkit, and I haven't got time to go into it in detail, as you see, this is one way that the toolkit could look. It helps practitioners to understand inequalities, make diagnostics, find solutions, and then try and learn from how well those strategies are. So the toolkit, the idea is going to be full of resources and guidance for practitioners. It's my last slide. This is a 6-month project. We're going to have to work very rapidly. We've already got underway. There are longer-term plans, though, about developing a dedicated website, pilots happening in Spain and Guatemala, and a launch in 2018 to begin a rollout across countries. So it's a very ambitious program. We're hoping for it to break new ground, and within that we aim to maximise the impact of this research on academic research through creating this tool which will allow practitioners to understand inequalities in an informed way, designed to allow them to design informed and effective strategies to tackle inequality.
I'm very sorry that the rest of the team are not here. I think the world is becoming more and more difficult to travel around, and they had visa problems. So this is a team who is now in India. They belong to an organization called Pradhan, which has been in operation since 1983, so one of the most longest standing organizations in India. Starting out by working with poor people in the hilly regions, which had been bypassed by the Green Revolution. And these are regions which are primarily made up of Adivasis and Dalits, or what the Indian government called the tribal scheduled tribe, and Dalits, who are the untouchable castes and known as scheduled caste. That is the official language. So Pradhan has worked with a number of families in the poorest states of India for many, many years. Pradhan it stands for professional, I've forgotten. Anyway, Professional Assistance for Development Action. And the focus on professionalism, I think, was a move away from the idea of being, charitable and do-gooding, and focusing on the fact that to really sustain livelihoods of people in very challenging environments, you needed certain technical skills. You needed to be engineers, environmentalists, natural scientists, and so on. So Pradhan began out very technically focused, working with poor people. It focused on women, because women were seen as more responsible of the family members, and they were seen as the poorest of the poor. But over time, one of the interesting things about Pradhan, for a group of engineers and so on, a very introspective organization. And so we see changes, transitions in their approaches over time as they learn from practice. So they started out by organizing women into self-help groups to encourage them. The word was thrift, to get them to look forward, to save, and to lend to each other. Over time, they started then go into supporting livelihoods with, I remember when I first met Pradhan, they were talking the opposite to it. Everyone else talks about scaling up. They were talking about scaling down, because some of the technologies that were available for irrigation were impossible for the extremely tiny plots with which their constituents worked. So it moved into livelihood support. It had self-help groups. I came into Pradhan around 2005 when we were asked to do an impact evaluation of what they were achieving, and we used some of their indicators. And we found that while they were doing extremely well on the livelihoods front, their members were, growing, diversifying their livelihoods, they were managing their subsistence. Somehow the more intangible stuff, participation in the community, empowerment of women, was not really coming through. So contrary to what they had assumed, livelihoods improvement did not translate into a political change. So one of the things they did was to then expand their platform to have much more training And then they started to collaborate with a feminist organization called Jagori in India, who they brought in to train their staff to become much more sensitive around gender issues. So Jagori has just finished. They had a 4-year project. And I think there is still a desire amongst Pradhan members to find out whether this feminist training or this feminist, consciousness raising, how it fits with the life worlds of tribal people. Because after all, tribal people in India have their own communities, their own ethos, their own way of life, their own relationship to nature. So one of the things that we will be doing in this project is to go back to some of the areas in which Pradhan has been working, but where this feminist intervention did not take place. Scheduled tribes are amongst the poorest. And India, of course, is a place where absolute poverty coincides with relative poverty. The people at the very bottom of income deciles are absolutely, chronically, and severely poor. And I'm not going to go into the diagram in any detail, but just to tell you that even in 2005, scheduled tribes, the tribal people who are about 8% of the population, made up 25% of the very bottom, and just 1% at the top. And that inequality has actually widened. So they now make up a larger percentage of the very bottom deciles compared to 1993. So we are now moving in, post the feminist training, into what should Pradhan do about really challenging some of the power dynamics within tribal communities and in the relationship of tribal communities with the larger society. We found the evaluation that came out of the feminist intervention found that there was a deepening of understanding of inequalities, found that many of the self-help group members were willing to go to local officials, put forward their petitions, etc. But violence, domestic violence, has not really changed very much. Women's power and decision-making has not changed very much. And while they can go to officials to ask for, justice, whether they get justice or not has not changed very much. So what we would like to do as a part of this project is to go to some of the communities and to work with them, not with a predetermined feminist framework, but a much more grounded theory approach of what aspects of their lives they would like to see changed, what gender justice, what social justice means if it's not coming from the outside, and how we can carve out pathways for change that are adapted to the pace that they can take. So this will be parallel to what has been done in the feminist intervention, but it will be a much more grounded theory approach. It will be located in the life worlds of tribal people and trying to, in a sense, work out a pathway of change, possibilities for change, that are rooted in what they feel that they are capable of doing. And we're going to do it alongside, the government found this self-help group approach very attractive, has adopted it, but may not quite get what is required to build capabilities of extremely marginalized groups. So we will be working with these groups that have organized by Pradhan, but alongside groups that have been organized by the government. Pradhan cooperates with the government. The area we'll be working in has a very high Naxal, Maoist insurgency presence, but this has never interfered with the work because Pradhan positions itself as non-political. So what we would like to do is see whether the government self-help groups, Pradhan self-help groups, are these evolving in similar ways, and are there lessons that can be shared with the government about making these groups much more effective. So I guess we're moving from a situation of livelihoods, a sole focus on livelihoods, towards looking at empowering women, and now moving towards empowering the community.
Okay, thanks very much. This project is with 3 colleagues from Serbia and Bosnia who can't be with us today, unfortunately, due to clashes with other conferences and visa problems. Getting into this country seems to be more difficult over time, but hopefully they will be all that will be resolved when they come to visit LSE in January next year, and later 2 visits next year. The project is looking at 4 countries in Southeast Europe: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, and Serbia, which are of interest because, well, for many reasons, but one of the things that we considered is that Slovenia has one of the lowest levels of inequality in Europe, whereas Serbia has one of the highest levels of inequality in Europe. And the 4 countries which we're looking at, they came, as you probably know, emerged from the collapse of the former Yugoslavia in 1991, about 25 years ago. But having emerged from a common system of social, economic, and welfare organisation, they've diverged in very different directions. So that experience forms a sort of natural experiment where we can look at the causes and reasons why inequality has changed in such different ways in a comparative perspective across the 4 countries, looking at what's happened over time since the breakup of that country. And so the broad influences that we can look at or we can consider might have affected the development of inequality are various. For a start, we have the breakup itself and the influence of the wars and conflicts which took place to different degrees in different countries and in different ways. We have the influence of the transition from a market socialist system to various types and varieties of capitalist systems, and we can trace that. We can look at the ways that privatization differed, both in scope and in the time scale of the privatizations which occurred in the 4 countries. We can look at the way the structure of the economies has changed, the deindustrialization in some of the countries, and the shift to service economies of various types, and in particular the degree to which the economies have been integrated into, more or less, into global value chains or into different types of trade and investment relationships mainly with EU countries. And then we can also look at the different welfare policies which have been adopted and the influences on those, and in particular the way that in some of the countries the neoliberal type of policies have been adopted, often under the influence of World Bank, IMF programs or advisors from different international aid programs. And we can furthermore look at the different degrees to which countries have been influenced by the process of Europeanization and European accession. Slovenia has been, for example, a member of the EU since 2004. Croatia became a member in 2013. Serbia is currently a candidate for EU membership, but Bosnia is not at that stage yet. It's only what's called a potential candidate. So the degree to which European policies and influences have affected the welfare state and in turn the outcomes in terms of inequality. So what we're going to be looking at is the household level surveys, so the SILK survey, Social Inclusion and Living Conditions survey, which is now available for 3 of the countries, Slovenia, Croatia and Serbia, and the household budget survey is available for Bosnia. So we'll be looking in detail at these household surveys and looking at the decomposing the inequality by social groups and trying to understand the different nature of inequality in the 4 countries on that basis, within the context of the broad conditioning factors which I described. And in particular, we'll focus on the effects of welfare state policies in the areas of labour market policy, education policy, and tax and benefit policies. And they're the 3 specific policy areas which we'll be looking at in more detail. And hopefully by the end of the process, we'll come up with some interesting findings, a deeper understanding of the drivers of inequality in countries which are in a post-conflict situation and going through a transition process and are in the different stages of European integration.
So I'm going to introduce the project that I'm going to be working on with Michael Macquarie in the LSE Sociology Department, with Hiral Shapiro from Texas, and from with Kazim Shepard, who is a documentary maker, filmmaker in New York. Our project is called the Revolt of the Rust Belt, but we have a pet name for it, which is going to be called Canaries in the Coal Mine, and I'm going to explain why. Michael's dying there. What we wanted to do is really bring a creative approach to a problem that the people with the numbers and the polls don't seem to be able to understand. And the problem that we are interested in is the problem. It may not be. We're not sure that it is a problem, but the problem of working class Rust Belt voters and their political persuasions. In the last year, there's been shock, horror, surprise, fear, but many scratchings of heads. What has been happening in Europe, but also in the US as well? What is happening with this rise of populism? Why did the British people vote to leave the EU? Why did the US citizens vote for Donald Trump? Now, these are things that colleagues all over the world, actually, have been really puzzled by and actually been terrified by. Those of us that are ethnographers kind of saw it coming. So what we wanted to do is really sort of start to think about ethnography and the narrative approach to what has been happening in these communities. Our approach will be narrative. Our research is going to be about the emotional effects of deindustrialization, what happens to people over time. The research that we are undertaking, we understand that time is very different in different geographies. So what we want to do is think about that process of time, normal time, and the process of historical time. The people that we're going to be working in and the spaces that we're going to be working in are deindustrialized spaces in the UK and in the US. Spaces that have long memories, that have long histories, that they start their histories 5 generations ago. They explain who they are through generations rather than through their own personal narrative. So we know that really this creative approach of ethnography, of being in the field, of measuring time and culture is one that we think is important. One of the questions that we're going to ask really is, how is inequalities connected to geographical space, but also geographical space and time? Inequalities relating to income, mobility, but also cultural inequalities as well. People and places in our study that have, like I said, these long histories, that time for them works on a different level. Consequently, our narrative approach to this research means what we want to do really is uncover these inequalities and what happens with people's trajectories, what happens in the future, how do they see their future, and then how does this connect to their changing political lives. We recognise that the trajectory of time in these communities often don't relate to other trajectories of time. And so our goal is to start to unravel the myths, but also the prejudices around working class, deindustrialised people's everyday lives. We want to end the misunderstandings about these communities. We want to highlight what has been happening here, not just for the last year, but the last 10 years, the last 20 years, the last 30 years. But also, what do they imagine their futures to be? And future, and I do think future in this project is going to be important, because when you ask working class people about future, they're usually not sure what might happen. And I think that that really has played a big role in Donald Trump being elected, but also the Brexit decision as well. How do people see their lives in the future? And I think this is something that we very rarely start to think about when we start to think about class inequality, is what happens in the future. My colleagues are here today, so all four of us from the project are here today. So if you want to ask us any questions, I'm sure we can all sort of jump in. The pictures that I'm showing today are images from my research in the Nottinghamshire coal mining fields, but also images from West Virginia in the USA. And what I'm trying to do here by just showing you images is to start to get to the feel of what we're going to do, which is to really start to look at this emotional approach to time, culture, class and trajectory, but also geography as well. Are we okay? Yeah. So I'm just going to finish off now with the canaries in the cage bit. The canary in the cage, or the canary in the mine, has always been tested down the mines on whether there's gas there or not. So you take the most vulnerable creature down the mine, and the most vulnerable creature in our case is working class people. Those images that you're seeing now are of Sports Direct, a 4-mile-long distribution centre in Shirebrook that used to be where one of the pits is, where we're going to study. The canaries here are working class people. How will they cope with this changing industry? How will they cope in this system of exploitation where they're earning less than minimum wage in some cases? Their communities have been devastated. So our canaries, let's see how long they last and how long they live, and then we'll see if we can roll that out to the rest of society. So thank you very much. That's everything that I've got to say.
So thank you very much to all 7 contributors who were incredibly interesting and incredibly concise at the same time. Maybe we should give all 7 of them a hand again. So these 4 projects are really exciting, and I hope that when we have the next Inequalities Conference, which is going to be in Cape Town in about a year's time, that we'll be able to get some of the results of this work presented at that meeting. So thanks very much to the presenters, and we look forward to seeing where you take them. I think what we've also seen is the sort of none of them is really a typical academic project. Maybe the Goodbye Tito one is a somewhat conventional comparative study, but obviously extremely interesting. But they all have elements of engagement in in terms of the way that the teams are constructed, in terms of the kind of issues they're using, in terms of the methodologies, that the Atlantic Fellows Program is trying to encourage a kind of a very creative approach to engaging with this terribly important question of inequality. So I just want to announce that we are having lunch, so those who would like to have lunch, there will be lunch outside. And remember to take all your possessions out of the room, because the room's going to be cleared while you're out, and look after them. And please be back by 5 minutes before 2 o'clock so that we can continue promptly at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Thank you very much.